Why don't we get started? I just want to welcome everyone to the first QPI webinar of 2021. I'm Randy Lewis from the Port of Grays Harbor. If you're seeing screens, you'll also see Kit Chope from the Port of Virginia. Kit's the chair of the Harbors and Nav Committee. I'm the vice chair, and I'm also the chair of the QPI. For anyone who's kind of new, the QPI, or Quality Partnership Initiative, is a joint effort between the Corps and AAPA, primarily and simply put to improve communications and coordination kind of on all fronts, and has been in effect for years. Today's presentation is an overview of WRDA 2020. The legislation passed Congress on December 21st and was signed on December 27th. Presenting today is Jim Walker. Is the Director of Government Relations for AAPA and coordinator with Harbors and Navs, and well known by everybody. Jim's going to present kind of some of the highlights and provisions that really are applicable to the port, to the ports overall. With this platform, as compared to others, we've got the ability, everybody's pretty much muted other than Jim. Jim won't have any competition. If you do have questions, feel free to use the chat function, and we will get to those, as it goes along. So again, kind of with that, Jim, thanks, and it's yours.
All right, thanks, Randy. If you wouldn't mind, since I won't be able to see the chat feature, just let me know as the chat questions come up. I'm happy to address them as we go, rather than waiting to the end. But I just need to, if you don't mind, just tell me and that we need to read them out, and we'll go that route. Uh-oh, what's my share? I thought I could do that. All right, so here's my first technology failure of the day. Let's see. Oh, Lord, I don't know what to do there. All right, let's go to this. Let's see if it's going to let me. All right. So, nope, wrong slide presentation. Second technical bust of the day. All right, so now we'll begin. The port highlights. Thanks, Randy, and Happy New Year to everybody. I hope everybody got to enjoy some time off over the holidays. Legislative calendar went much further into December than I'd have hoped for. But just still get to enjoy some time off and retool, sharpen the saw, get ready for 2021. To jump right in here, the little background on the 2020 HMT legislation, the CARES Act passed back in March, and it provided for the first of our 4 pillars that AAPA had, which was full HMT annual revenues use. It was inserted in the CARES Act. It was largely championed by Senator Shelby. It was a budget cap adjustment, and that's an important term because that's going to make it easier for the appropriators to provide that money down the line. It's not counting against their budget, their normal spending cap that they would have to spend to the Corps. And I'll go over some numbers that'll show you kind of why that's so important, because it's just a big financial jump for the Appropriations Committee in the additional money that could be coming to the Corps' navigation program for channel maintenance. In that CARES Act, it had an effective date. It took effect on January the 1st of 2021, or upon WRDA enactment. And that was because the senator recognized that there were these other things that AAPA was seeking, but that shouldn't be part of an appropriations bill. So he was counting on WRDA to take care of those other, we call them the AAPA pillars, in pursuing those things. And so we just had, basically now that put the pressure on us to get WRDA passed in 2020, because we wanted to have those things on the books to go along with this full HMT use going forward. Uh-oh. Renita, why don't you just take it back as far as and I'll tell you when to advance the slides, if that's okay.
Can everyone see the screen? Awesome.
Yeah, if you would go to the slide presentation mode, it'll make it a little bigger. I'm just always into bigger fonts. It's down over here on this down there. Okay, now I'm not seeing the presentation, Renita. There we go. All right, now, so the other dates in this have been that, it came out in the Senate in their draft legislation. They didn't include the HMT clause in that, but in the House they did. Word of the House, they passed their bill. In the Senate, it just got out of committee. In August, they began some negotiations. They were told to treat it as if it had passed, to go ahead and use what came out of the Senate, the committee, as the Senate's version of WRDA. And so September began the roller coaster ride of HMT is in, HMT is out, the back and forth of it. Let's go to the next slide, if you would, Renita. So what finally happened, and let me express my thanks to everybody on this call, your government relations people, your port directors, your DC port reps, other associations. We had an all hands, alarm go out on Sunday, December the 20th, that said that basically there's a disagreement between the House and the Senate over the HMT. And if they can't reach agreement, they're going to pull WRDA and not pass it. And so there was a number of calls, a number of discussions, some incredible, the folks using their connections, and really came down to Sunday night. They did get it resolved. The agreement was made. It got inserted into that bill, which was passed by Congress the next day. So if you can think about HMT, WRDA, having almost on the critical path of getting that legislation finalized, Congress passed it the next day. Did our happy dance, thought we were done, looking forward to enjoying Christmas. And the president then said he wasn't sure he was going to sign the legislation. So then began 6 days of angst over waiting to see if we could, if he was going to sign it or veto it or what was going to happen. But he did sign it on the 27th. I use the term landmark legislation, and I don't use that often in terms of, for me, WRDA 86 was landmark, WRDA 2014 was landmark in setting up the framework for HMT funding. This one, I think, really sets the course for the next generation in terms of HMT funding. The legislation addressed all 4 of AAPA's pillars. It got us the full HMT revenues. It addressed the funding assurances for donor ports, Great Lakes ports, and emerging harbors. Next slide. The key provisions that are in WRDA 2020, the very first one out of the box is probably the one that's of greatest interest to AAPA ports around the country, and that's the budgetary treatment of HMTF. This clause got us access to the $9.3 billion of unspent HMT tax collections. So this was a really important, and this was the part that was hanging things up on that Sunday evening. What was worked out was a schedule. It began at $500 million in 2021 and increases $100 million a year until it reaches a peak at $1.5 billion in 2030. These funds are in addition to the annual HMT revenues, and they are exempt from that budget cap. This provision is effective immediately. So when we start advocating for the fiscal year 22 appropriation, we're going to be asking for the prior year's revenues. $1.9 billion is the estimate. And we'll be asking for $600 million. That's the fiscal year 22 figure of this $9.3 billion. So our ask will be $2.5 billion of HMT funding for the Corps of Engineers to do that channel maintenance. Now, to compare that, the fiscal year 21 appropriation, which was part of that same bill that WRDA was included in, included $1.68 billion for HMT related work. which is a good number. I mean, it was, it continues this annual increase, but now we're looking to go from 1.68 to 2.5 billion in fiscal year 22. And that's where the budget cap is so important. The fact that the appropriators had been spending roughly $7 billion for the Corps of Engineers Civil Works program, of which the HMT was 1.68 billion. Now these HMT funds are going to be exempt from that budget cap. So what that means is that the appropriator should still have the $7 billion to spend on the Corps program, but this 2.5 billion that we're seeking, or HMT, don't count against that $7 billion cap. So think of it as if the appropriators just got a $2.5 billion increase in the funds that they can spend for the Corps of Engineers work. So that's where we feel like that's going to be essential for getting this money included in fiscal year 22. And that's what we'll have to be advocating for, is to make sure that this budget cap is carried out the way it was intended in the CARES Act and in WRDA 2020. Next slide, if you would, Renita.
Jim, there is one quick question on that.
All right.
Question was asked, at some point appropriators will work through all the surplus, but the surplus funding provision doesn't appear to sunset. What do you think on that?
It's one of those that depending on, I'm going to be an optimist that Congress will fund that full 600 million. If not, then, it's going to carry over. The $9.3 billion is actually earning interest. And the interest was something like $150 million last year. So the fact that it's going to continue to earn interest, even if it's not being used, as you spend it down, that interest on the balance continues to accumulate. So it can carry us beyond, that point. Yes, at some point you'll exhaust this 9.3 billion and the annual incurring interest, but hopefully by that time, and that's another element that I think we as H&N committee need to working on, is the tracking of what's getting accomplished with these funds, and the idea that we should see properly maintained navigation projects as this additional spending gets put into dredging and keeping these channels open. So my view is that those funds should be sufficient for us to get these channels back into a state of good repair and to continue that maintenance going forward. But that's one of those remain to be seen. But the fact that it doesn't sunset just means that additional funds, if there are years when they don't appropriate that full amount, that's going to continue to be available to be spent even beyond 2030. I guess that'll say we got it. The next provision in WRDA section 102 had to do with the funds distribution approach. And this is where our 4 pillars came in. The emerging harbors, they got 15%. This is where Congress did what it was going to do. It negotiated these things. These percentages are a little different than what AAPA proposed, but we knew going in that was going to be the case, that Congress would decide what it wanted to set in the way of these funds. So emerging harbors is to get 15%, the Great Lakes 13%, donor energy transfer 12%, a new category which wasn't even part of our request, commercial strategic seaports, and these are members of the National Port Readiness Network, and that is something that the Department of Defense works with through MARAD, and they establish who's in this group. They get 17%. That is not really seen as being impacting on past spending. When I looked at the numbers, it was between 16 and 18% from 2016 through 2020. So 17%, it's established in them as a category, but it's not going to require any sort of a change in how the funds are distributed over past historical practice. The next thing I show there is to say that it's mutually inclusive. I'll explain that in a subsequent slide, but this doesn't go into effect until October the 1st of 2022. So that being said, here's where we're back to advocacy. and the 2023 appropriations, which will come out in the president's budget request in February of 2022, the appropriators will have a decision to make. They can pursue full use of this distribution approach and these funding um, because they'll be doing their work in the April and May timeframe for the fiscal year 23. So the fact that it doesn't go into effect, it still says that they can plan on that going into effect and they can choose to do that, but they could also choose to say, we're going to wait until the next fiscal year to implement this. So our advocacy will help us with deciding whether it gets implemented in fiscal year 23 or fiscal year 24. But that's what the date is going to mean for us. It also has the expanded emergency harbor use program, a $5 million authorization. The champion of small harbors, Chairman DeFazio, the House T&I Committee chairman, was really seeking that. And it's to do something along the lines of what donor ports can do, although this one is cost shared and has a $5 million ceiling. So it's again, it's an authorized program that the administration would then have to request for funding, or Congress would say that they could fund, put funds into the appropriation for a program like that to be implemented. Next slide. Go ahead.
And also there's another question was, why wouldn't they implement it in FY23?
It's just one of those that if they're looking, because the deadline date is October the 1st, and they can choose to say, I'm going to do it this other way. I'm not going to say that we implement it until it goes into effect. And maybe these bills normally can often pass. Let's say the House passed their 2021 appropriation in July. So if you've passed your appropriation, you're kind of saying you're done with it. And that's before it really goes into effect. So it's something they can choose to do. And that's just where we just want to try and urge them to choose to go ahead and consider it being implemented with the 2023 appropriation. Next slide. All right, so National Port Readiness Network, as I mentioned, these are the list of the ports that are in that group. Like I said, they sign agreements to turn over their terminal facilities for the military's use in times of mobilization. So they are designated. And so it's not something that somebody can just, I guess you could request to join, but it's something that you work through DOD and through MARAD to be added to this list. And the link down there actually is a hyperlink, and it'll give you more information on the program if you want to learn more about it. Or you can just Google National Port Readiness Network. Next slide. This is where, when I mentioned about things being inclusive, and I had to develop this to have discussions with the Appropriations Committee staffs. I used the Great Lakes as was my example and said, okay, in fiscal year 19, the Great Lakes got $203 million. And of that, a certain amount went to high use, commercial use projects, a certain amount to moderate use, a certain amount to emerging. So the $95 million that you see in the very center of the program, those were emerging harbors in the Great Lakes. That $95 million counts to both the Great Lakes percentage and the emerging harbors percentage. So it's not like we've divided up and 70% of the Corps' funding is going to be driven into these various groups of projects. If you're a National Port Readiness harbor and you're getting maintained, it's counting towards meeting those funds. So it's just one of those things that the Corps, what's really intended is for the Corps to continue to take a national perspective of maintenance needs across the country. At the end of how they would look to distribute those funds, they check and they say, did 12% of these funds, 15% of these funds go to emerging harbors? Did 13% of these funds go to the Great Lakes projects? If that's happened, it's a check mark and you're done. If there needs to be some tweaking, they'll take another look at it. But I think there's even still the maximum extent practicable in terms of the language that's in the bill. But the intent is for the Corps to see about making this happen. But you could reach the day, let's say, where the emerging harbors, those that are eligible for maintenance, that have the environmental clearances and things, are all maintained. And so there's not the need for that level of funding for emerging harbors. I'm just picking that as an example. But if that were to be the case, then the Corps would not be bound to continue to provide that 13% of funding to the I'm sorry, well, 15% to the emerging harbors. My apologies. Not the neatest of slides, but it was just way I could do it to help explain the thing for the appropriators and to the Corps leadership on how this could be made to work, how it could work. Next slide. So this one, just to give you an idea of the funding to be coming to the maintenance program. I went back a couple of years, 2020, the HMT estimated revenue, the maintenance portion, and you see what was actually appropriated. And this is again where Congress exceeded, that goal. 2021, they met the goal versus 1.679 versus 1.68. Now 2022 is where you see this big jump. So again, the 2022 estimating $1.9 billion of HMT revenues. That number may or may not change. We'll see next month when the administration issues their budget proposal for fiscal year 2022. The 600 million that's in WRDA says that we'll be requesting $2.509 billion for HMT work in 2022. I've always continued to get asked that question, can the Corps spend that much money? What a problem to have. I used to wish I was with the Corps when I'd see that kind of an increase, as far as give me that opportunity to spend that money. There's a lot of work that needs to be done out there. Then there's the question, is there enough dredging? I believe there is. I believe there's dredges that have come back to the United States. There's more construction. But keep in mind, this isn't just dredging money. There are other navigation assets. There are jetties, breakwaters, groins, disposal areas, type of things that will need work as well. So the Corps, my urging right now is for the Corps to really get serious in their thinking of how they'll approach having a program like this. And, it may sound greedy, but not only if we're seeking this as far as our annual appropriation, but we're still pursuing, if there's an economic stimulus, we want to see money coming out of that for the Corps navigation program. So it's a time to say, strap on, get ready. You've got a lot of work coming your way to execute in these coming years.
Jim, this is Brian Henricks at Foth. Was there any talk of any of the money being able to go directly to ports, or does it all have to go through the Corps or MARAD?
No, it all goes through the Corps. None goes to MARAD. This is a Corps of Engineer program and an appropriation. So it's still going straight to the funds are appropriated that go to the Corps of Engineers. Now, there are two other authorized uses of HMT funds. St. Lawrence Seaway gets roughly $36 million a year, and Customs and Border Protection get about $4 million a year because they are the keepers of the data. They collect the HMT revenue, the checks, and they send that over to Treasury and keep track of the funding. But when the appropriators are looking at it, and goes back to the way Congress is organized, the energy and water appropriations folks don't consider those other two agencies. They just look at this as saying, look, this is HMT revenues, 95+% of this is going to the Corps of Engineers. We're going to treat this as just a Corps of Engineers program. So they're not subtracting what goes to Customs or what goes to Department of Transportation for the St. Lawrence Seaway out of these dollars. They just look at this as what there should be spending for the Corps' navigation program.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So you see, let's go back one if you want for just a second there, Renita. And you're seeing the stair step each year of the increases that come So ultimately now you're starting to talk about, on the horizon 5 years out, $3.2 billion coming. Now that's based on, I estimated the revenue, the 1.909 is something that the administration published last year. And I just took a 4% increase in HMT revenues on each subsequent year. So that's one way to approach it. There's plenty of other ways that are all valid as far as what you want to anticipate the HMT revenue to be. But for me, that's we'll see what that is. And then we'll proceed on with the funds that are coming out of the 9.3 billion. Next slide, please. Some other key provisions that are in WRDA, the section 103, this annual HMTF report. I look for this one to potentially be expanded. Not only are they wanting to track what the Corps is expending on these efforts, but I anticipate Congress wants to know what's getting accomplished. And this still goes back to the Corps' implementation of asset management principles. The idea that those of you with ports that have jetties and breakwaters, there's an evaluation of the condition of those assets. The idea that if you've got them in a failing condition, you should be among the first to get money. And then once they do that repair work, the asset condition improves. The channels, as you know, if you've been part of the Harbors Navigation Committee discussions for any period of time, that's an ongoing challenge to come up with something to be able to figure out how to describe these channel conditions and that way of an asset because of the dynamic nature of shoaling and sedimentation that takes place. But there's some smart people out there. We're going to figure out a way to do this. We've got to, because ultimately we've got to be able to track and report what's getting accomplished with the funds that we're receiving. Next slide. So section 105, this one, it has to do with just cleaning up some things. Some of these things are streamlining provisions. But this is, if you've a port where you're looking to try and get, again, if you're fortunate enough to have sources of funding where you want to proceed on with the construction of the project, or you want to do this, administer the work yourself, even if you want to do the locally preferred plan, it lays out a approach for the acceptance of that construction so that the federal government then takes over the maintenance of that project once the construction is completed, and it expedites the review and approval process. Next slide. So the beneficial use program, this was a biggie. It began back in WRDA 2016 when it was first initiated. There was to be a pilot program with 10 projects. It expanded in WRDA 2018 to 20 projects, and now is expanding in WRDA 2020 to 35 projects. One thing that I noticed in there that I think is a plus is that now you can look at the benefits of beneficial use placement as well as the additional cost. In past efforts, and this is more with feasibility studies and channel improvements, you counted for the cost, but you didn't account for the benefits. And so doing something that was good for the environment actually lowered your benefit to cost ratio in the idea of the BCR and your feasibility study. So this corrects that. And additionally, it's requiring the Corps to prepare a 5-year dredge material management plan for each navigation project that's in their inventory that identifies the anticipated dredging cycle, if it's an every year thing, if it's every other year, if it's once every 5 years. But the idea behind it is to establish not only the dredging event, the quantities of material, and to provide the public an opportunity to be aware of these things and to seek these beneficial use opportunities with enough lead time to work out environmental permits and to have these discussions. And so it's not all of a sudden, December, I just got my fiscal year 21 appropriation. I got 9 months to spend this money. I don't have time to go back and modify environmental permits for a beneficial use application. So this is putting more of a longer range horizon on the dredging program and allowing folks to be aware of it and to hopefully make good use of it. And somebody, I just gave this presentation an hour ago, if you can imagine, or some points of it. And they said, well, it hasn't been funded. And that's correct. It goes back to WRDA is an authorization document, which says, may. And the may is followed by subject to appropriations on some of these programs. So it establishes it and it gives it the opportunity, but it still has to receive appropriations. And this particular program has not received an appropriation to date. But I look at that in two ways. One, we should still be advocating to get the program funded. But two, I think we need to be taking a harder look at opportunities to beneficially use this material that in some instances leads to a no-cost solution or even a cost savings. When I look around the country and see so many ports where the dredging is taken to an offshore ocean dredge material disposal site 20, 30, 50 miles out into the ocean, that's an enormous transportation cost to haul that material out there and dump it. There may be something near shore that can be done if you start viewing again that it's a resource. It can be used. It can be used for coastal storm damage reduction if it's sandy. It can be used for creating wetlands. It can be used for nourishing or raising the elevation in wetlands to compensate for sea level rise. So there's a number of these factors, and I think a number of them will come up that will actually not require additional cost. But I think that what's really needed are discussions between the ports, the core districts, and the dredging contractors, along with public stakeholders, to help understand what's the art of the possible, pursue those type of events, and get the environmental clearances to enable those types of efforts to be tried and to see how it's working. And I can point you to a half a dozen success stories around the country, but they've all been done at no additional cost to the channel maintenance. So while I love it as a program, I think the reliance on this in many instances was like, well, okay, well now how can we get our beach done, or additional cost features. So I'm on my soapbox. I'll stop there. Next one, Renita. Acceptance of funds for harbor dredging. This is an interesting provision. It wasn't one AAPA was advocating for, but I thought I'd highlight it. It's one that is allowing the Corps to both assist ports with technical assistance, or even to receive the money and administer the contracts to dredge these areas outside of a federal navigation channel. That could be access to the federal channel. It could be in the berthing areas. It could be in marinas adjacent to the federal channels. So I really think it was something more for small navigation projects that have a federal navigation harbor. And many of these ports that may not have an engineering staff that's trained or capable of advertising and administering these contracts. So it's an opportunity. And again, this just establishes the authority for the ports to seek this out with the Corps if they so desire. Next one. Replacement capacity. And the word replacement there has to do with dredge material placement facilities. It has to do with the shared use so that it's not exclusively for federal material out of the federal navigation channel, but some combined use for the project sponsors, ports, to place material from their berth dredging into these sites. And I've asked Grady if I don't know if he's had an opportunity to research this. I'm hoping he can shed a little more light on the specifics of that. Let's see, Renita, I don't know, Grady, we may need to try and unmute you. There's Grady. There, okay. I asked him to, ask him to unmute, but. Okay, all I can do is ask you to unmute, but Grady, if you would, unmute and.
Now?
Yep. Hear you.
Real briefly, that I'm not sure of the origin of this language. The theme is similar to a QPI cause over the years, and several attempts to alter the process that the Corps used for private use or non-federal use of project designated disposal areas, placement sites. It's essentially a reinforcing function that it seems to leverage Section 217 applications versus the alternative of using the 401c. It adds the option of the sponsor to, in a project that has multiple sites, it seems to offer the ability to designate different sites. However, it puts cost implications to be paid in advance of any use by a sponsor. However, there's an interesting clause is sometimes if the sponsor is deepening a terminal and the material being placed in a site is useful as structural fill for a dike raising or other purpose at a site, the sponsor can receive credit for providing the borrow material essentially for site rehab or whatever the Corps would deem as that this material is useful for operations and maintenance of the site. So they would receive a credit. Then the other thing that still needs to be researched, and the sponsor can designate an alternate site or request the secretary to allow it, and it seems to silently go around Section 408 if the sponsor cared to provide that construction for the increased capacity. Again, we're going to have to wait for implementation guidance, and hopefully the Corps will entertain a discussion on what they believe this means before they put out the guidance. And the other interesting thing is that they put a public comment clause for these activities, which is puzzling and probably not in the interest of time of any sponsor's needs, you know, in with respect to the time it takes to get a permission worked out in the agreements. Over.
Now, there's all of these WRDA provisions are subject to public review, but to hear that this particular actions under this particular section require public review is a bit puzzling. And like I say, it does require additional time. WRDA 2018 required that a new process be implemented for WRDA provisions going forward. So all of these provisions, like this one being Section 145, the Corps will draft implementation guidance, but they're required by this law, to share that draft, receive input from stakeholders and the public, to share the stakeholder input that was received with Congress, and then finalize the implementation guidance. So it's going to take longer to get the implementation guidance completed, but it's assuring that stakeholders, ports, non-federal sponsors, associations like AAPA will get a voice in helping frame this implementation guidance. And another pluses I see of that is that we were advocating for a lot of these changes. We know what we were seeking. We understand what the spirit and intent was of the law. And so in many instances, I think we can help inform development of good implementation guidance to carry that out. So I do look forward to that. Now, this particular clause and a public review of actions under this clause, that's a puzzling one, but we'll see where that takes us. But thank you, Grady. I appreciate you doing that. Let's go to this next one, Renita. Section 161, studies of water resources by non-federal interests. If you've been down that path, it's kind of known as a Section 203 study. This one, a long time ago, authorized ports to do their own studies and then to provide that report to the chief of engineers for their review. There have been some challenges as with how the Corps can actually review these and provide input to the chief to make recommendations for Congress to then authorize it to proceed to construction. But again, I'm calling on a subject matter expert, David Miller, to give us a little explanation because he's led a lot of those type of study efforts. And I think he's better versed to give us what some of the specifics of this particular provision. So David, if you can unmute, or if you need help, let us know. Renita, I don't know if you see a participant as far as the DMA or David Miller, DM. Um,
No, I'm not seeing one.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, we'll skip it. If David does come online, we'll come back to it. But let's go on to the next slide, if you would. All right, so a couple of quick ones here. We're on.
Jim, just real quick, on the 203 stuff, I believe that David would agree that what we pursued and what was passed requires some conversation between the people wanting to do a 203 and a core.
Okay, wonderful.
We didn't get what we wanted.
Okay, I mean, for those on the call, we've been at this for a number of years and we can't seem to get it quite straight. But I don't know if it's because they talk to us and they talk to the core, and they don't get all three of us in a room to hash this thing out. But and the core is not willing to work with us in that regard. But we're going to get this thing figured out one of these days and solved. But okay, more to come on that.
Essentially, Congress interjected themselves into any 203 process now.
Oh.
There has to be report and consultation with Congress on studies.
All right, we'll see what that'll mean for our future. Thanks, Craig. Let's go ahead to the next one there, if you would, Renita. Oh, yeah, this is the one. Okay, so like I said, I'm almost to the end. The titles of studies and reports, new feasibility studies in the coastal navigation realm, 2, the Lower Columbia River Turning Basin, and Houston Galveston. So those will be now beginning to seek funds for feasibility and pursue. Let's go to the next slide, if you would, Renita. And then in Title 4, the actual completed feasibility reports, the chief's reports, now these are approved and ready to proceed to construction. So you see the 9 that are listed here. This just means that they'll now be eligible to get that new start designation as far as seeking funds. They'll be going with preliminary engineering and design funding, and then looking to get the new start for construction. But that gets added to the list. I think we've got 12 projects around the country that are currently at some phase of either underway or awaiting a new start designation. So these will get added to the list, but it may take a year or more before these are added to that list as far as really ready for that new start designation. Congratulations to those folks, and let's go to the next slide. I wanted to show you a quick glimpse of the 2021 legislative calendar, the type of bills that we're going to be working on that are of interest to ports. A quick rundown there, the infrastructure investment / COVID. We're hearing a lot of talk about something either for economic recovery, for economic stimulus, or infrastructure investment. And so that's, we think, is going to be early in the administration, maybe February, March timeframe. The fiscal year 22 appropriations could start as early as February. That's traditional, but it's more likely with this new administration, they put out what they call a skinny budget in February and then follow it up with details in the April or May timeframe. To give you an idea, the Trump administration, when they came in their first year, they were May submitting their budget request. But that's our timeline for looking to take advantage of those opportunities to advocate for fiscal year 22's funding. The Surface Transportation Bill, there was a 1-year extension. It expires the 30th of September. So there's opportunities there for legislation. Some of the things that we see there, there's a marine transportation system emergency relief action, but there's other things that we may look at that are still associated with ports, and that same thing with trade promotion authority that gives the president the ability to expedite a acceptance of a trade deal that's reached. And no sooner than we get through with WRDA 2020, we need to be taking a look at, things that maybe we requested that didn't get included, new things that are coming up. But by the latter part of the year, we need to be getting our list together for WRDA 2022. So if you have things you want to bring up, we'll get to talking about them and look forward to that. The data privacy and security is another piece of legislation that ties more with the cybersecurity issues with ports and trying to, I think that's our opportunity for that aspect of port operations. And then Department of Homeland Reauthorization. That one's amazing. There's something like 30 different committees in Congress that have jurisdiction over the Department of Homeland Security. So it's not something that's an easy piece of legislation to pull together and pursue, but we're thinking that there may be something that happens in that regard in 2022. We want to keep an eye out and be ready. So next slide. I mentioned the Harbors and Nav engagement for 2021. This implementation guidance for the WRDA 2020 provisions would need to be on top of that. Advocacy for 2022 appropriations. Again, this is a all hands effort because of this first time out of the box, which is always the toughest to get to that full revenues and to that $600 million. But that's the reward we get if we're successful in our advocacy. A summary of that again is that we need to think about how we can identify these channel conditions. The asset management term there, the state of good repair, but how do we describe the conditions that we have in these navigation channels? And to say that, you know, the additional funding, and I think this is going to require a wholesale change in how the Corps even approaches its maintenance dredging. Because honestly, for the better part of someone's career, I mean, you could spend the last 30 years, the Corps it's been a budget driven, a funding driven program. You take the funds, you've requested the funds, you take what you receive, and you do the best job you can with the funds you've received. So this isn't coming from a standpoint of an engineering analysis of how to best dredge the project to keep those channel dimensions available for an extended period of time until another dredging cycle. And I think that's where we need to be looking at how we're having discussions with the Corps and how we approach maintenance dredging in the future. But this information is going to be really important as we advocate for that $9.3 billion, as we advocate for economic stimulus, for infrastructure investment. Having this type of information that says that we've got a number of jetties across the country that are in this condition and we can raise them up to this level of condition for this amount of money. That's what resonates with Congress. That's what gets the appropriations. So we need to work on our messaging and having those type of things ready to go. And it's incumbent upon us as ports. We're the benefactors of this as far as the Corps doing that work. And so we can't just say that's a Corps issue, or that's a Corps need. And if the Corps doesn't provide it, then they don't get it, because we still suffer as ports without getting these things maintained. So I believe that's my last slide. Let's go one more, Renita. There are a couple of things that we've mentioned for WRDA 2022 that have come up. This double payment, as ports are looking more, this is a containerized port issue where you take it off of the ship and you put it on the dock, and then you transload it over to a barge. Then that becomes a domestic cargo and it gets paid. You have to pay the HMT twice. So we're looking at, and this could be something that's in the surface transportation bill, a designation to clarify that, clean that up. One thing that we had sought with the Donor and Energy Transfer Port program was this, we established a 3-year average for these ports, but no sooner than we did that we had something like COVID come along. And you see it on the energy ports, especially the Gulf Coast, where the need for gasoline, for aircraft fuel took an enormous nosedive in 2020, such that then ultimately the tonnages went down. So something of a national emergency, national disaster, a natural disaster with hurricanes that maybe shuts the port down for an extended period. The ability to have a waiver of a year for those that are already in this program on that 3-year requirement. So that's another one that we're putting on the list to take up the next WRDA legislation. And with that, I believe that's the last slide. Let's go one more, Renita, and double check it. Yeah, thank you. Okay. I may have missed some questions. I see there's some things in the chat box down here. So, will the Corps have to issue implementation guidance on the expanded uses? Yes. Each and every provision in WRDA 2020 is supposed to go through that process. Now, that said, the previous provisions with regard to the Donor and Energy Transfer Port Program were very specific. So the Corps essentially took that language and just restated it in there, maybe just a small amount of, okay, then talk, the districts are responsible for talking to the port, the local sponsor of that navigation project for their decision. But, a lot of these other things, the formulas, all that spelled out. So it's something that I think could be addressed fairly quickly and move forward with the implementation guidance. And one thing in the previous administration, the assistant secretary really pushed to see as much of the implementation guidance could be issued in the first 90 days. Now, I don't think that's a possibility in this new process as far as the public notice and things, but that's not to say that they can't get that draft implementation guidance out very quickly, get that feedback, and it may be minimal, and then proceed on to close it out. So it will be some period of time, but hopefully it's not like it's going to take a year or more on these that are not very complicated or controversial. And honestly, I don't see a lot of these proponent pieces of that being all that difficult to summarize into implementation guidance. Would waiving a year for donor energy transfer interactions, any funding provided through MIT-SERA, the MITS? I don't believe so. For me, they're two separate programs and they're coming under two different committees of jurisdiction in terms of the appropriations or even on the authorization committees. So the donor and energy transfer program, that's T&I in the House, it's EPW in the Senate, it's energy and water in the appropriations. MIT-SERA came under the NDAA as an authorization for that program. The funding comes under transportation, housing, and urban development. So I think those are independent, and I don't see a potential overlap there. That said, we can use it to leverage if it helps us in making our case. But anyway, I don't see that as a requirement or a potential problem for it. Channing was asking about donor and energy transfer ports. What I'm looking at is maybe having a separate discussion for those ports, just because of to go through some of the details and the specifics of that program. And I'm looking to try and get that scheduled next week. So if you could, Channing, I'll plan on I'll get with you as far as making sure I get that covered in that discussion. Let me see if I missed any others. Why wouldn't they implement? Okay, I think I did cover that one with 23. There's a question about sunsetting that provision. I think I've covered that one. And we cannot see your slide presentation. I think we covered that one. So I think I've covered them all. Am I missing? Is there any others that, let's see if any came in at the last. Okay, that's the last chat that I see. I'm getting Randy shaking his head. Am I on my hour? Look at that, 2:59 and 20 seconds. Okay. I think that's about it. I don't know that we've got a topic for next month just yet. If you've got topic ideas, please submit them to Randy or Kit or myself. We'll track people down and twist their arms to give some more of these great presentations, this one excluded. And then we've got to be talking about our spring conference. I anticipate that again being a virtual meeting. Stay tuned. We're going to work on dates for that. And because we've looked to just probably continue the format that we've used for the 2020 meetings, which was 3 afternoons, 2 hours per afternoon. and going over those topics. It did come up, Renita just reminded me to say that this has been recorded. It's going to be available. God knows why anybody on this would want to look at it again, but you've endured 1 hour of my ramblings. It's going to be on the QPI website. You get there basically by going to the Harbors and Nav Committee webpage. If you go to aapa-ports.org, anyway, apa-court.com, query Harbors Navigation Committee. You scroll down that committee page and it gives you that QPI link. And right at the top of the QPI webpage is a list. This is, I think, webinar 21 in our series. And so we'll have the recording there that, and if others want to see it, missed it, you want to let them know. We'll see what the number of views are and how this all works as far as continuing that practice in the future. But I thank you for your attention, and Randy, I'll leave it for you for any wrap-up remarks. Your kit.
I just want to thank everybody for participating. The number of people who attended was excellent. We appreciate the questions, the interaction. Jim, don't sell yourself short. Very good kind of cover of all of those issues and stuff. Again, there was a question as to whether or not a separate webinar on one of the topics, those type things. That's the type feedback we're looking for. So as you've gone through this and you think about it, please get those questions, or suggestions for working on parts of this or other issues, and we will definitely continue on, put something together for next month and beyond to kind of continue this process. So again, everyone, thank you for attending, and have a great day, and we will see you again.
Thanks, everybody.
Crowd leader. Plus, use our app